everyone. This is John Monarch, the CEO of ShipChain. And we wanted to discuss something that's really, important right now, especially given the current situation of the pandemic. And we wanted to talk about how supply chains for the pharmaceutical and medical supply world will move forward, especially with all of these changes that are coming, with all of these critical and massive changes that have happened in the world since really February or March of 2020. So we wanted to introduce our esteemed guests here. First off, we've got Evren Oskaya. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. This is Evren Oskaya. I'm the founder and CEO of Supply Chain Wizard. We are a management consulting and a technology company based in Princeton, New Jersey, with global presence and primarily serving pharmaceutical manufacturers and life sciences manufacturers in their challenging supply chain problems.
And Evren was also with us on our high value and controlled substances webinar that we did previously. So we want to thank you for joining us again.
Yep, my pleasure.
Chaitali Mehta.
Good morning, everyone. I am Chaitali Mehta. I'm a director with EKF Global Logistics Private Limited. I am a third-gen customs broker and a second-gen freight forwarder. We are a 43-year-old company, and we have offices all over India.
Thank you for joining us today. And Kay Odepi.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kay Odepi. I'm a supply chain manager with Bayer US. I have close to 15 years experience in global supply chains in different geographies from West Africa to Europe and now North America. And I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation.
We're very pleased to have you. So thank you for joining us. We wanted to focus on the past, the present, and really what the future challenges are lying ahead, because we know that, for instance, there's been a lot of challenges getting PPE, getting drugs to where they need to be. And it's really exposed a lot of the way we kind of have single source supply chains, as well as just different issues that have popped up from capacity. We're seeing reduced capacity in both ocean, air, and trucking as a result of, for instance, reduced passenger air cargo. And we wanted to kind of run through that and see. And what I want to ask first is, what changes and new trends have emerged due to the pandemic in the industry? Evren, would you like to lead that one?
Sure. So, in the supply chain world, obviously our primary job is to balance the supply and the demand, right? In most cases, a shock to the system typically comes from the one side of the equation, either a demand shock or a supply shock. But unfortunately, this is a very interesting situation where we see both a demand shock and supply shock at the same time, especially for the life sciences pharmaceutical industry. On some products, there's a huge demand increase because of the, let's say, the protective equipment needs, or certain drugs are in high demand. On the other side, certain products or services are in extremely low demand because of social distancing and stay-at-home type practices. So the companies, in some cases, can be experiencing these both at the same time on the demand side. And as you just mentioned, on the supply side, because the capacity is now constrained because of the flights are significantly reduced, and the business travel is significantly reduced, the supply shock also is affecting many different aspects of the supply chain. So it's really an unprecedented situation. Companies are not necessarily fully prepared for it, but I think they are just starting to evaluate where they are, what the situation is, and how they can improve from here. From a trends perspective, obviously getting out of the crisis is the number one priority. But the number one trend that I see that I want to highlight in this webinar would be around the visibility and the control of the supply chain with more digitalization, rather than relying heavily on paper-based or manual processes. So that's a trend that I already started observing, with more and more companies taking steps towards taking an action for the future of their supply chain being more digital, which is definitely accelerating. But happy to deep dive into more, maybe some other comments are here on the trend topic.
I actually agree with that as well, because we've seen a lot more push towards digitization of documentation and just making things flow a lot better. Now, Chaitali, for instance, how would you see this from the Indian perspective? Because I know that India, for instance, shut down all exports of manufactured drugs during the pandemic for quite some time.
Yes. So actually for India, you see, for the logistics industry, we never really thought that we could work from home, which was the number one change that has actually happened. Our processes have been, whilst compared to the other countries, we are doing pretty well. But yes, in a lot of ways, they were cumbersome and long. And we do depend heavily on manpower, and our paperwork is legendary. It was surprising that it was surprising, or rather I would say very shocking, when we shut down the entire work by 22nd of March, once the bans were in place and we had the lockdowns, and it took people by surprise and shock, and the industry did scramble, because even though we are technologically dependent, a lot of processes require office and workspace. So that was like the number one trend which actually happened. Number two was, like all of you mentioned, the technology and digitalization, the importance of that has emerged very strongly. So all the companies which were already digitally advanced or were technologically empowered have done wonderfully in these last 4 months. In fact, I would say that they have cruised and not even sailed or walked. A lot of our manual processes have been corrected or converted to digital. So I should say a shout out to our Indian customs, because they have worked so hard in making our processes digitalized, whereby making things much easier in terms of our customs clearances, both for imports and exports. Another trend is obviously going to be optimization and cost saving initiatives, because nobody really expected this. So the normal processes were in place, and with the pandemic coming and the normal supply chain shutting down, airlines not operating, barring of course the freighters and all, there was a huge gap between the demand and the supply. Plus the essential services, or the definition of the essential services and the essential commodities, pretty much stopped the general goods from being manufactured or being exported, even if they were ready for the same to be exported. The new trend is of course for the passenger flights to be converted into cargo. But I think the most important, which is worldwide and not just an Indian phenomena, is the importance of logistics and supply chain, which has come to the forefront. People are actually realizing that we are not invisible, the entire industry, and that we are actually responsible for global trade and for the movement of goods from one place to another, whether you take your ships or your airlines or your ports, airports, your transporters, your vehicles, everybody and anybody who plays. So I firmly believe that it has emerged that the logistics industry is the spinal cord to the world, like what our spinal cord is to the body. So that is like very important as far as we are concerned. The other thing would be that the API chains have to be shortened, and indigenous API suppliers need to be developed and encouraged, because we are one of the largest exporters of pharmaceuticals and manufacturers, but surprisingly, we are heavily dependent for our raw materials on China. So that was also a shock, because when our imports were affected with the standoff between India and China, it definitely impacted the pharma industry.
I especially agree about how supply chain and logistics professionals used to be kind of pushed into the back office, that no one really looked at or talked about or anything. And now we've really come to the forefront, and companies are realizing how critical really good supply chain professionals are to their operations. So that really is one, I guess, somewhat of a positive to come out of all of this, because every one of us is seeing that as well. Now, what are some of the challenges in the current pharmaceutical and medical supply chains, and have they been exacerbated by COVID-19? And I'd like to toss this one to you, Kay.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, like my colleagues have actually mentioned. I mean, inherently, we do have challenges in supply chain management that we have coped over the years, and I believe the effect of COVID-19 just really exposed and just amplified some of these challenges. I'm going to just walk you through a few of them and just put like a few supporting comments to each of them. And for sake of perspective, I'm going to be speaking with respect to the consumer health portion of pharma, because that's my area, and mostly North America, because I'm based in North America with the buyers in Canada and maybe to a large extent in the United States. So the first, obviously, was the fact that we have a lot of overseas imports coming from all over the world into North America. And I mean, this has always been an issue because we're very self-reliant on the rest of the world. And obviously, COVID-19 hit home big time because all of a sudden, North America or other countries are cut off from the rest of the world, right? So it's now a question, how quickly can you get products from outside of your shores into your country? And I think it kind of, mostly for the Canadian business, I think, it kind of exposed this chink in the armor because I mean, Canada is it's labor intensive, so cost of goods is quite high in Canada. So the general tendency is to outsource, and the concept of outsourcing to countries in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, obviously was exacerbated because all of a sudden you're cut off from the rest of the world, unlike before COVID-19. A few of my colleagues also talked about just the complex end-to-end network that we have in supply chain management, from source all the way to deliver, right? And because it's quite complex, you have multiple key players involved, from the API manufacturers to raw materials to bulk manufacturers to packaging components. So all of a sudden, because of this complex network and the number of people involved in playing this game, you are now as strong as your weakest link. So now you are dependent on the weakest part of your supply chain, which may not necessarily be in your own country. So all of a sudden you're seeing potential bottlenecks spring up in your value chain, right? Which was exposed by COVID-19. And just speaking to that concept as well, in pharma, I think pharma and consumer health notably, there's a lot of dependence on single sourcing. So you have suppliers who are your sole suppliers or sole source, where you sole source basically. And COVID-19 clearly exposed that. So if your supplier is somebody who's based in India or China, like my colleague said, then all of a sudden you're exposed. The risk is real, right? And that was an eye-opener to the team. That was an eye-opener to the team that all of a sudden single sourcing networks was not advantageous. Clearly, that was before COVID-19. That was not an issue because we're trying to leverage scale economies and just move all your volumes to one single supplier, especially since these pharmaceutical products are quite complex as well. You invest time, you invest money. So typically you want to invest in one supplier. So that risk was quite exposed in COVID-19. It was mentioned earlier, lead times. And again, I kind of allude to that first point I made about sourcing overseas. We're heavily dependent now on sea freights, and all of a sudden sea freights that would take 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, are now taking 6 weeks. The time doubled basically. So clearly, just long lead times that was an issue before was just amplified after COVID-19. In my business, consumer health, forecast accuracy is an issue, is a big issue, because you have constantly changing consumer preferences, consumer needs. And like it was mentioned, when COVID hit, this just went to a totally new level. I mean, I've heard my colleagues say in the office that when I say my colleagues in sales, my colleagues in marketing and demand planning, that they've never seen this kind of trends before in their careers, and they probably will never will see it. So all of a sudden, you're having major disruptions to your supply chain coming from forecast error that you cannot react to, whether timely or in the quantity required. And in North America, like you know, I mean, we have a very demanding customer base. Like the retailers are quite demanding. So with COVID-19 breaking in, I mean, shelves are completely empty, and there was huge pressure coming from these retailers to restock their shelves, and that pressure was passed up the supply chain to manufacturing companies, to suppliers, and clearly that was a major gap that we saw in COVID-19, because all of a sudden, you know, customer is king, as is correct, but now you have to react to it in a more timely fashion. So these are just a few examples of what I think were existing challenges that were in the supply chain, but which clearly was made much worse by COVID-19. And just to add that the supply chains that have succeeded in trying to surmount these challenges were probably the ones that were most prepared to tackle them. Thank you.
So, Kay, I want to add something to your comments and what you're observing, because I'm also based in North America, in New Jersey area. Pretty much, all the big pharma companies are spread around me here within 15-minute driving distance. And when we were looking into the vulnerabilities of the supply chain, like the end-to-end supply chain, one weakest link that you mentioned, the weakest link part, is the API sourcing for North America. Right. So when we look at the FDA approved sites around the world, there are plenty of sites that are not producing API that are based in North America. But when we look at the API sourcing sites, only a quarter of those sites are based in North America. Majority of them, 75 to 80% of them, are actually outside of America. Primarily China and India. Right. So that's one weakest link that we can highlight. And then the single sourcing part obviously makes things worse because of if you have a problem with your one and only supplier, then you don't have much options. It was a design choice, right? When we talk about the trends here, for the future of the supply chain design, in the past, what we have been doing is because of a stable supply, stable demand, let's find the lowest cost supply chain possible. And the lowest cost supply chain might have a long lead time. One supplier doesn't, have much change to manage, so you can afford to just run it that way. And companies made a lot of profit out of the low cost supply chain. But now in the pandemic era, or much more volatile demand and supply situation, we are realizing that the lowest cost supply chain is not the answer. So maybe the answer is more towards more flexible and responsive and resilient supply chains, which is not going to be the lowest cost. But what is the trade-off here is a big question for the executives to answer. Do you want to take the risk and just run your supply chain as usual, like lowest cost, and then struggle, may even lose your entire market position in a crisis like this? Or would you like to design a more flexible supply chain and maybe introduce some dual sourcing, additional redundant capacities in the system that you would pay for, throughout, but then you would get the benefits like an insurance policy when the time comes. So these are very important strategic questions, but unfortunately not an easy question to answer for the executives.
It is, definitely. And that's, first off, I want to clarify one for our listeners and our viewers that when we say API, typically I think of the more technical, like application programmable interface. But in this case, it's active pharmaceutical ingredients. And one of the things that I know came out of this is there was a discussion of, speaking of single source supply chains, something like 90 to 95% of the antibiotics that are available in the United States market are actually manufactured in China. So there's been a long discussion about that and how we can open up those more flexible supply chains. And it's like you just both mentioned, that the costs that come with it, we have to balance whether or not it's worth it. And I think that as a result of that, we're going to see a balance in new online tools. I mean, patients are becoming more comfortable with telemedicine and remote visits, medical apps, medical records apps, even that they control themselves. But I think that patients really have, at least in the United States and just in general and worldwide, people are generally shielded and they don't see the costs that are behind the scenes. which has its upsides and its downsides, of course. But with were the current medical supply chains ready for a pandemic like this? Were they ready for a system shock such so large like this? And Kay, I'll toss this one to you as well.
Well, thank you. I think my answer is yes and no, and I explain why. No, because like it's been said, a lot of companies, a lot of supply chain was not ready for this kind of disruption. This is disruption both on the demand side and the supply side happening at the same time in all countries at the same time. So it's clearly unprecedented. So I don't think companies would say, "Oh, we saw this coming and we're ready for it." No. I would say though that even though certain companies were not clearly ready for it, I would say in some aspects though, some people were poised to take advantage of this opportunity, as I call it. And I actually call them winners and losers in the supply chain industry, really. So aspects like e-commerce, right? I mean, we've been talking e-commerce for years now with Amazon, just changing the dynamics and the norm regarding brick and mortar versus online shopping. A lot of companies saw this coming, including the retailers themselves, right? In North America, for instance, the likes of Walmart, Shoppers Drug Mart, Loblaws, they saw this coming because they were losing share to Amazon, and they started preparing for their own online platforms. The same thing with manufacturers. We saw it as the way of the future, where even though in terms of volume itself, the e-commerce business was not that significantly large compared to brick and mortar, but it represented significant growth. So a number of companies were poised to start taking advantage of this. I can say, for instance, my company, we started talking about e-commerce for 4 or 5 years now. And the benefit to that is because we started that conversation early and we had put in certain mechanisms in place, we had started having conversations with the players in the market, it was easy to take advantage of the surge that came, because all of a sudden e-commerce skyrocketed. I mean, we're recording demand increase almost in like triple the normal, like 300% of normal demand, right? Coming through e-commerce. So for companies that were poised on having conversations already around this particular area, it was easy for them to take advantage of it. Also from the angle of just supply chain resilience. I mean, some companies probably have gone the extra length of pressure testing their supply chains, whether it's with policies, whether it's with compliance, regulations, and just going over and above the required, right, to make sure that the facilities are compliant. So that when COVID hit, it was almost like, oh, nothing really has changed. We just need to increase or add this other aspect of our compliance to stay competitive and stay open. So as an example, I mean, you see companies investing in protocols like safety protocols, health and safety protocols, which before COVID-19, people would think it's over the top, right? Because it's quite some investment developing those protocols. But when COVID hit, because over the years, they had people in these manufacturing sites or companies had just built that discipline and the rigor of going through these protocols, it was easy to just make that transition with the more stringent requirements of COVID-19. So the learning curve for them was not as steep in that sense. So in long and short, that's my answer. Yes, in the aspect of demand surge, of being disrupted on both sides of the spectrum, I don't think we were ready. But then, yes, in the aspect of certain companies had put in building blocks in place that gave them the competitive advantage to just take on the opportunities that COVID-19 presented. And that's why I say some were winners, some were losers.
I agree. And now, has this added a lot of cost to your supply chains, and how do you plan for that going forward and budget for that going forward?
Definitely. I mean, and we talked about single source, which was like the norm. But now there's that drive or that conversation going on to say, is it worth it? Is it worth it being exposed to that level of risk? So clearly, people are now looking at, oh, do we multi-source? Which obviously you're going to lose scale economies, and by losing scale economies, your COGS are going to go up, your unit costs. So for me, procurement cost it's right there. You don't have that buying capacity anymore with one supplier or one vendor, because now you're going to spread that volume across multiple suppliers. So your unit costs are going to go up clearly. We talked about transportation costs already. I mean, I for one have experienced. I saw significant jumps, exponential jumps in the cost of air freights. I mean, at some point it was as high as 6 times the normal rate just to air freight something from Europe to North America. I mean, for me, that's something that has been since March. It hasn't changed. Where it's now like a disincentive to even consider air freight as a way of mitigating supply gaps or risks, because it's not just worth it, because it's just going to erode all your margins. Same thing as ocean freight, obviously not as badly hit as air freight. We saw like a 20 to 30% increase in costs in sea freights from other parts of the world into North America. So that's a reality we're going to live with, because it hasn't subsided, and I don't think it will subside in the coming months. Going on to the next point, inventory costs. One of the reactions, or one of the ways of mitigating this high surge in demand, was people increasing safety days of inventory, just as a buffer or as a safety net. And because you're increasing your inventory, clearly you're tying down working capital. And then your cost of cash, the cost of days of supply, gone up, and that's capital you're tying down. So clearly, the higher the inventory, the more money you're tying down with just holding that inventory. And by extension, you have to store that inventory somewhere. So clearly, your inventory, your warehousing costs are going to go up as well. I mean, most warehouses charge by pallet, the pallet space that you occupy. So the more pallet spaces you occupy, clearly the more costs that will go up. For me as well, labor has also been a key factor, because all of a sudden, overtime costs were shooting through the roof. We had to, we've seen people bring in more shifts, more teams to try and increase capacity. It's going to cost money, right? People are running Saturdays and Sundays. People are running weekends, public holidays. So labor costs clearly has gone up with the advent of COVID, and it's something, as we still struggle to stabilize, as we struggle to get back to normal, if there's anything like that, it will still be an issue. Because I mean, you look at capacity profiles or capacity utilizations of manufacturing sites, it is almost 100% utilized in most cases. So that's going to stay. And last but not least, I alluded to the fact that customer shelves are empty, and what that means is you're open to customer fines, penalties, and delists, because a retailer will not keep holding your product if you're not able to supply. So they will fine you, they will give you a penalty, or they delist you outright. So for me, these are the additional costs that we have to grapple with since COVID and post-COVID as well. And it's definitely going to stay with us for a while.
And Chaitali, how about your organization? How have the costs been, how have costs impacted you during this entire time?
Oh, to be honest, the costs have been extremely high. They were not factored in, because what happened is that for us, where like I stay in Bombay, it's pretty much like New York. Most of the people use the public service transport system. So the buses and the railways, which is are the lifeline for the people in Bombay. And after 22nd of March, everything has been shut down. Now, an average person travels about 45 to 50 kilometers one way to come to work, and the same back. Now, majority of the people, because they use the public transport, everything stopped. And the only way that you could bring them to work was either by private cars or to hire buses. Now, depending upon the size of your organization, you had to make arrangements. Plus, Bombay is a very big city. It's grown all the sides, so it's like a circle. So you have people coming from the north, from the south, different parts. And it's been very exhausting lining up everybody to come to work. We also had issues where the government mandated that first it could be 30% of your workforce, then it was 15% of your workforce, and it went down to as low as 10% of your workforce. So for us, one of the biggest expenses as far as the company has been the transportation cost in the last 3 months, because we send private vehicles to making sure that all the safety norms are adhered to. And we bring our staff to work. That is number one. I completely agree with what Kay said, because the air freight rates have gone through the roof. So where a particular shipment would cost us $1 or maybe $2, it's moved down to $8, sometimes even $10. And there was no guarantee that the shipment would be uplifted. So yes, the clients were extremely upset. The sea freight rates have also gone up. So the transport, because what happened was that there was a mass exodus of the people living in the villages wanting to go back, because most of them live in rented apartments here. And since nobody was really sure as to what was going to happen in the initial months, everybody wanted to go back home. And you can't really blame them, because they live in small houses here and their families were worried about them. So overnight, it happened that we had like almost about 100,000 drivers of vehicles go away. Some of them left the vehicles in the middle of the road. Some of them just dropped them off at their parking point. Some of them stopped them outside the airport or outside the ports, and they just left. So it was so chaotic. And where, you could have a playing field as far as transport was concerned, overnight the transport cost became 3 times, 4 times higher. So if you had a contract and their rates were specified and it was an annual contract, there were clients who were not willing to understand that because of COVID, all of a sudden you had a shortage of, there were vehicles, but there were no drivers available. So what would happen was the laborers, the migrant laborers, they went away. So you didn't have CFSs having laborers. So how do you load and offload or stuff and destuff your containers? As a result of which private laborers were costing the earth and the sky, name it, and it was like that. So yeah, it has been extremely bad. The airports tried doing the best that they could, getting laborers or working with limited amount, but obviously the operational costs have increased drastically. And for us, a financial year starts from April to March. And, when your first 2 quarters go bad, you are dependent on your third and the fourth quarter. And in India, we didn't really have a very nice 1920. So everybody was banking on the last quarter to do really fine. And then this problem happened in March. And so we thought that, oh my God, how are we going to mitigate the losses? Because an entire month has gone away. So many of us were shut down in April, and yet salaries had to be paid. And May was when essentially a lot of companies started working. So yeah, cost-wise, it's been a nightmare, to be very honest. And all of us keep talking about it, and we say that 2021 is gone. So we are not really expecting, if as long as we probably do net or we recover our operating costs, I think we should be happy. So none of us are really talking of profits this year, and we're just trying to figure out ways whereby we can reduce the overhead costs. A lot of people have given up their rental properties. They are reducing their staff if it's possible to. They are also giving up their warehouse spaces, because if there's not much of warehousing happening, and Where possible, they are trying to get people to work from home by investing more in technology. So they prefer now investing in technology than hiring people. So they like, if we can reduce our staff, but we can get better technology, then what we were working with 15 people before, we could probably work with 7 or 8 people, and the salary of the balance guys would mitigate the cost of the technologies. So yeah, it's been a challenge, and every month we try and see where we can cut costs. Thank you.
No, absolutely. And it seems like a lot of industries are going through a very similar type of issue, especially with single source and then all these new costs coming from it. I mean, we've
Yes.
seen the same in the food industry. Food has been, having to get redirected from restaurants to grocery stores, for instance, and all of these restaurant supply companies have been struggling with that and setting up deals that they never thought they would. I mean, going direct to grocery retailers, for instance, from restaurant supply companies, it was almost unheard of, and now it's being done. And to really wanted to ask also, how digitized do you feel the current medical and pharmaceutical industry is? And do you think that we'll see more companies implementing new technologies in the wake of COVID-19? And if so, like, what technologies do you think they're looking at? And Everin, I'd like you to take that one.
No, absolutely. How digitize? This is the key question I've been asking. The industry, myself, in our webinars and conferences. How good is the pharma life sciences industry? How digitized are we? Actually, there is a research paper on this from McKinsey, and they documented and they quantified the digitalization levels. They call it digital quotient, the Q level of all industries. And pharma is actually ranked among the lowest of digitalization, only ahead of public sector, right? So the pharma is only slightly better than government, the digitalization. And you know how the situation is, the government paperwork is. So our starting point is not very good. However, that is also an opportunity that we have a lot more to gain in this digitalization. So wherever you look at, you see opportunities. Companies are already, have been talking about it, but they never felt the urge or the need, or they never put the budget together to do this when the times are good. But to Chaitali's point, like, everybody's looking at your cost base right now and seeing that if I can do this with less cost or less people, with more automation, I would do it. And some of these decisions are almost like becoming mandatory right now instead of nice to have. For example, I'll give you an example from our company. We are both consulting and also software solutions, technology solutions company, right? So this year we started, especially the last couple of months, we started seeing many more requests for proposals coming that are looking to digitize their factory operations, for example. I mean, we have been in this space producing innovative solutions for the last 5-6 years, and we are often the ones telling the story of the benefits, but it doesn't necessarily stick with the majority. Only the innovators or the early adopters would follow this, right? But now seems like that tide is turning towards like more and more companies seeing the need. For example, one of the basics of pharmaceutical manufacturing is batch tracking. Or logging with the paper-based logbooks. Like majority of the companies, I would say maybe more than 90% of the factories are still on paper. Wherever you go, whether it's the biggest of pharma brands or the smallest generic players and anything in between, right? And they were fine for the last many decades to work on paper, but now all of a sudden, since not everyone cannot go to the site, you cannot see what's on paper. Right? This remote work also created the need to see things in digital, in the cloud. And now we are seeing more and more companies like starting their paperless factory initiatives, trying to find solutions like digital logbooks or electronic logbooks or electronic batch records, right? I will see that this is going to continue to accelerate on the digital factory front. And then when it comes to, again, in manufacturers, because most of our clients are manufacturers, there are two types of camps in the manufacturers. Ones that are seeing great demand surge, so they need throughput and capacity ASAP. And there are those who are seeing a demand loss, who then, all of a sudden see their revenues below their cost line, and they need to cut costs immediately. So there's not too many in the middle, by the way. There's not too many manufacturers that are stable, you know, in this age. But for both of these companies, they need digital technologies to see how they can increase their throughput when they have the demand to fulfill. And if they don't have the demand, they need to see where to cut costs. What are the utilization levels of different departments? What are the bottlenecks? What are the excess inventories, excess capacities that they can cut down without impacting the revenue? So in all these scenarios, whether you're seeing a demand surge or loss, the companies are starting seeing the benefits of digital, and they are already taking steps in investing their factory management. But then in the broader supply chain, I also see more and more partner ecosystem type technologies, like how do I better manage my suppliers, my carriers, my 3PLs. Before it was just an email transaction, telephone, even fax, for God's sake, still existing on like transaction level. How do I manage this more electronically in the cloud so I can better collaborate with my partners to be flexible when the change comes? So in all these aspects, I think one shocking statistics that I see recently in the maybe in the e-commerce world. So the statistic was that the e-commerce share of the overall commerce was around 5-6% 10 years ago in 2009. It gradually increased to 16%, so about 11% more penetration in the last 10 years. And then we saw another 11% increase the first 8 weeks of the pandemic. So what we see in the last 10 years happened in the first 8 weeks of the pandemic for e-commerce. I don't know if the same trend would, or the same numbers would hold in the pharma supply chain digitalization. But clearly, what we are going to see, in the normal times in years, I think we're going to be seeing in months and in weeks. And whoever is positioned to capture the opportunities will be significantly better off versus their competitors. That's what I predict.
Yeah, John, if I may add to what everyone also said.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, relating to, he captured it so beautifully. But in the aspect of demand planning and forecasting, I think it's a science, it's an art, but I think with COVID-19, it was so clear now that you have to use more than human judgment to be able to predict demand you've never seen before. So, I mean, I've seen a lot of people gravitate towards artificial intelligence for data modeling and just demand planning and forecasting as well. So I see this as something that's going to stay as people utilize artificial intelligence and bots to be able to do things more efficiently and probably achieve better results in terms of accuracy.
It's interesting, and we see that technology is really starting to get more pervasive in every part of the, just really every supply chain worldwide. And one of the questions we often get asked is about how do we prevent fraud? How do we prevent counterfeiting? And, of course, as a blockchain technology company, we feel that having that sort of immutable record of everything is a good way to do that, because you can record everything down to really, if necessary, down to the pill level or the dose level. But at the same time, right now, especially in a pandemic, we see runs on drugs that might not be safe, or, we look at issues that pop up from counterfeiting in general costs the industry billions of dollars per year. But along with that, it also risks, thousands or tens of thousands of lives every year. And being able to certify and prove what actually is an authentic product, I think, is more important than ever, especially as we're looking towards general supply chain security and just protecting the well-being of the customers and people in general. So I guess really one question I have then is, do you see that we'll have stricter regulations in place after the pandemic? And if so, do you think that these regulations are going to be temporary or they're going to be long lasting? And Chaitali, I'll toss that one to you.
Thanks, John. Actually, there are going to be stricter regulations as far as India is going to be concerned. And yes, the restrictions would be imposed. Some would be temporary, but some would be long lasting. When I talk long lasting, the first one that comes is the major dependence that we have on China for the imports of our raw materials, for the pharma packaging material, for the small components for medical devices. There is definitely going to be some kind of a restriction levied coming in the long run is what we are anticipating. It could be either by way of increased duties or maybe anti-dumping duty on these imports of these products. Also, what could happen is that the government may try, the anti-dumping duty normally comes into picture when they want the local import, when they want the local players to have an equal level field as compared to the imported products. So we are anticipating that if not now, then in the near future, because our government has Atmanirbhar project which is going on, they are going to encourage indigenous API manufacturing as well as the packaging, pharma packaging, which is again very important. There is also to ensure the GMP and GDP guidelines are followed. For quality, various checkpoints could be placed. Now, the travel bans may be temporary, but it has definitely and will definitely impact the overall method of doing business. And for India, like I mentioned, there's going to be increased efforts to reduce the imports, because that is prima facie right now the main concern which is there, to reduce our dependency on imports and try and set up industries here, try and give them the kind of facilities, the infrastructure which is required, whereby they can set up the manufacturing units over here. Also, the other thing which is going to be there, we don't know how long lasting is going to be. I guess it purely depends exactly parallel to how long COVID remains, is the working environment with social distancing in mind. So there could be we already have new workplace norms, there are new regulations, new requirements from the point of view of companies. When we are calling staff to work, there are certain things that we have to make sure. So keeping that in mind, social distancing is going to again be a very important aspect, and that's also going to determine as to how people are going to take forward either their manufacturing facility, their manufacturing practices, or their office environment, because there is not much clarity on that right now, whether this is going to be a temporary requirement or whether going forward it's also going to be there. So yeah, it's going to be depending upon industry to industry. The effects could be short term or it could be long term.
I agree. And I think that government, for instance, will get involved with more, there's going to be a lot stricter enforcement of customs and importing, like you had mentioned, and with governments all over the world looking to insource critical goods, I think that that's going to play much more of a role. So hopefully we start seeing customs digitization happen a lot faster rather than traditional methods of transmitting information or even paper documents right now.
But John, I would like to mention that, one of the plus points of COVID-19, besides the fact that the logistics industry is slowly getting its due recognition, is that in India, the customs and the government have gone a long, long way in getting the paperwork digitalized, which I have mentioned before also. And it's actually phenomenal at the pace at which it is happening. So in that respect, I think it has been definitely a blessing in disguise, though the cost of that has been extremely high. But we cannot complain on that particular point. But yes, the governments of all the countries are going to look, it's just not India, because quite a few countries, whether you take India, you take China, you take Vietnam, you take Bangladesh, any of the manufacturing countries, the importing countries are going to look within themselves to see how can they reduce their dependence, which may not be good for countries like ours, where exports plays a very critical role for foreign exchange remuneration and earnings and all. But eventually, many countries will look at self-reliance, and that is, I think, going to be like the key for any country to succeed, is because we've already seen what happens to a country which is predominantly dependent on imports of everything. Like just today, I read that Singapore's GDP is down by 41%. So you take countries like Singapore, you take like UAE and all, which are dominantly dependent on imports and all, then yes, when your supply chains get damaged or they get weakened, then it becomes a very critical factor.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Chaitali, I want to add on that. Obviously, the topic of lowest cost supply chain versus the most resilient and flexible supply chain. I think
Yes.
the downside of this trend would be on the countries like India, China, as you mentioned, that are benefiting or have been benefiting for a long time now on the low cost movement, right? That's why a lot of manufacturing sites moved there or increased, and those countries became the supplier of the world.
Yes.
But it's only natural that the developed world, like Western Europe or United States, they are now taking a more critical look at this, and it's not going to be exactly the opposite. It's not going to go on to the other extreme. It can't, just because of cost reasons, but it will be some level of balancing. There's already a regulation, or at least a government action around how do we fund companies in the United States for in the United States manufacturing. They are awarding contracts, government contracts, to manufacturers to open up sites, manufacturing sites in the US to produce vaccines, for example, which is only normal and expected. I think the question is, where do you draw the line? What is the balance?
Yes.
In this situation, who is going to win? Who is going to lose? Again, it all comes down to, again, at the individual micro level, with companies who are ready to compete, still provide that flexibility while at a low cost, will continue to survive and thrive, right? But those companies who cannot be flexible and responsive and cannot be maintaining their low cost situation will unfortunately be in the losing end of the spectrum.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then this regulatory point of view, I can say a few words on that too, because like most of our history as supply chain wizard, we were helping pharma companies comply with track and trace regulations. We served 9 of the top 15 global generic drug manufacturers in various capacities in implementing their track and trace projects, selecting the right vendors. And I only see the regulations being expanded, not only to different countries, which obviously beyond United States and European Union, many of the other big nations have a track and trace regulation already. But as we see in Russia, for example, the Russia regulation is not only about drugs and life sciences products, it's also about all the other industries, food and beverages, luxury goods, automotive, you name it. So I think the counterfeit issue, and I can tell maybe with some numbers, it's not just a life sciences issue, it's a global issue, which I think a couple of years ago, the amount of counterfeit trade was about $1.7 trillion annually, of which only $200 billion or so was pharmaceutical trade, counterfeit trade. So pharma was only 5% or so of the global counterfeit trade. Still a lot, obviously, but I think this regulatory framework will be expanded, and life sciences could serve very well as a blueprint for the other industries to follow, because no other industry has the type of anti-counterfeiting regulations and rules like we have in pharma. And these expertise and solutions and everything developed here would find opportunities to replicate in the rest of the world and rest of the industries, in my opinion. And one vulnerable part of the supply chain we talked about, the APIs, the raw materials, right? They are exempt from the regulations right now. So the regulations only cover the finished dosage goods, that are produced and packaged already. So not the upstream supply chain. So I also see the regulations being extended towards the API, the upstream supply chain, as the time passes and these security issues become more and more critical. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I 100% agree with both of you that the regulations are only going to become more stringent and just more broad in general, and it is likely that we see more of the raw materials start getting covered by a lot of those as well, and the traceability concerns, especially as we work to prevent counterfeits. Now, one question I do have is, let's give a couple of brief sentences or points on what trends do you think need to change in pharmaceutical and medical supply chain management? So what is a trend right now that doesn't look like it's working out or may not survive the COVID-19 radical shift. And Chaitali, we'll pass that back to you as well.
Thanks, John. I think one of the main ones is going to be that supply chain visibility needs to be improved. So the next generation wireless technology continues to fuel digital transformation. Deliveries with social distancing and hygiene are going to be the new norm, and they are going to push for the best part. So that has to be restructured. Obviously, it is already in the process because shipments have been going back and forth and all. So it's like a work in progress over there. Supply chain, like Evren and Kay and everybody's mentioned, supply chains will have to be more flexible and shorter, ensuring just-in-time deliveries. That's going to be the ones who are going to be able to have a flexible way of working and a cost-effective way. They are going to survive and thrive. Work on innovative and new ways to reduce the cost, improve the service, and an aggressive approach will be looked at, including cutting of inventory. So maybe a conservative supply chain may emerge. Alternatives to regular practices to be created so as to not stop the supply chain. That needs to be done. I think in a lot of aspects, alternatives have already been started to be applied in the last 3 months because of COVID. Alternative medicines and nutraceuticals for immunity boosting will probably emerge as a front runner. India's public health care definitely needs an overhaul. It needs more investment and improvement. And I am hopeful, and we as an industry and as a country are hopeful that now the government will pay more attention to this because of COVID-19. Planning actually is going to be of key importance because there are so many vaccines which are at the development stage and could be manufactured. The vaccine manufacturers would have to collaborate better with their logistics partners before rolling them out. Of course, we export a lot of vaccines, and the logistics companies are already well aware of what the vaccines would require. But definitely, because the volumes are going to be so gigantic and the temperature to be maintained between 2 to 8 degrees for such big volumes could be a problem, whether we are talking with temperature controlled vehicles, we are talking with warehouses, even though we have a lot of cold chain and our airports are geared up for it, like Bombay Airport has the biggest pharma cold chain warehouse that we have right now. But still, the vaccine manufacturers would have to give more advanced intimation. Another thing would be, or rather another key player who would have to regulate their rates would be the airlines, is because they definitely would need to understand that right now what is happening is like a very rare circumstance, that because we don't have passenger flights coming in and we only have freighters, and passenger flights are being converted into freighters, but not every airline is bringing in their flights. Therefore, it is right now their time to make the money, though they will say that they are bleeding, but the rates that they are charging do not justify the means. And if pharma has to improve, and if these products have to be made available at reasonable prices to consumers across the world, then airlines collectively in total will have to figure out either special rates for pharmaceuticals related to COVID-19 products, or in general to pharmaceuticals, even though they currently have their pharma rates. But they definitely cannot continue charging what they are charging right now, because it's not going to be possible for every pharma manufacturer to afford charters, whether they are going to be part charters or an inducement. Only the big players may be able to afford, because they have those kind of markets to supply to, and maybe their products are priced in that way that they could, and I'm sure even in the long run, the big players may not be able to afford an indefinite supply of charters. The vaccine movements have already taken, I've already mentioned that the temperature control, which is there, especially for countries like, continents like Africa, the governments will have to play a very big role in making sure that their countries are equipped to handle the inflow of the vaccine movements, because otherwise these vaccines are not going to reach the patients, are not going to reach the consumers in the right fashion, in the right manner, at the right ambient temperature that they are required. And we've all spoken about this. The product sourcing and dependency on one country, on one supplier or a handful of countries is going to be rethought of. Another thing what is going to also be rethought of is for companies that are dependent on any one product that they are handling, they are going to rethink and see how they can diversify, because if you are going to survive the next couple of years is by only diversification. So here in India, we talked that in 2008, we had the depression kind of a situation, and only companies which had diversified, could be 3 products or could be 10 products, but they had different verticals and they had different products. They are the ones who survived and went laughing to the bank, and that is what is going to happen right now too. So it could be pharma companies who are looking at only one particular kind of drug. They may have to create new verticals. Maybe the other guys who already have 4 or 5 products under their portfolio may have to increase because the demand may be for certain other types of drugs. So yeah, these are some of the trends, or rather in pharmaceuticals, which would have to be restructured according to me. Thank you.
Absolutely. And one of the things that this really shows is a need for risk management through technology. And, as a technology company, we speak to that quite a bit, but it's very interesting because people are used to real-time data and real-time information, up to the second data. But the problem comes from both air cargo and ocean cargo, especially where you don't have that available, because it's really not possible to record that information and deliver it by, there's no wireless internet in a cargo plane at 37,000 feet. There's no access to cellular networks. There's no way that satellite internet on a container, even if it's a refrigerated container, really makes a lot of sense from a cost perspective, even for very critical goods. So it's something that, how do we trust the data? How do we know that the data hasn't been tampered with? And that's something that we work on, is that even though it's passively recording along the way and not reporting back, being able to authenticate and show that the data hasn't been tampered with, very good use case for a combination of IoT and blockchain, along with being able to model out and show like different routes or different lanes have been more problematic from a temperature excursion perspective. And we see that quite a bit. I mean, there might have been an issue with a specific carrier, or maybe the passive cooling on the ULD and the air cargo failed for some reason, or there were other issues that came from that. And how do we identify that and prevent it in the future? So a lot of this, we see it as a technological risk reduction strategy that really applies well to pharmaceutical particularly. And really wanted to kind of ask the last question, actually, and that's, what's your overall outlook for the industry, both in the short and the long term? And do you think that this is going to normalize when the hype dies down and there's a vaccine, or do you think that we're really entering, when I say a new normal, waves of this virus, and vaccines will only be so effective up to a certain point? How will we handle that, and how will the industry work to handle that? And I'll start with Kay on this one, and we want to get everyone's opinion as we go.
Thanks, John. I have a famous quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson that says, "The mind, once stretched by a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions." So the long and short of your answer, of your question, is I don't think we'll go back to pre-COVID times, because in my opinion, and I think everyone on this panel agrees, COVID-19 was a pressure test of supply chains and, as a whole, organizations. And we've seen losers and winners emerge from the last 6 months of this pressure test. And there's been a lot of learnings. There's been a lot of eye openers. There's been a lot of critical thinking to say, this week we were caught napping when this thing hit. How do we prevent this going forward? So I don't think we'll go back to our old ways after COVID-19. And I have a few pointers here just to kind of buttress my point. So really in the short term, I still see what we're doing right now will continue, which is really operational and tactical reactions to the disruption and the shockwaves we got from COVID-19. That will continue. So as an example, for instance, there's still a lot of prioritization of available capacity to certain critical categories that we're seeing growth and true demand or consumption. So you see facilities that have limited resources, limited capacity, will divert their resources to those what I call big bets, rather than just spread themselves thin. So that will continue. I still see the ongoing trade-off between cost and service, where people are looking at the cost of doing business or the cost of doing a particular activity versus the impact on service. So as an example, we've talked a lot about air freight. I mean, air freight in my organization has been like a mitigation tool to say, okay, if we need to get something in faster, improve speed to market, do we consider air freight? But in recent times with COVID-19, it's clear that the cost of air freight is punitive, and it's margin, it erodes margins. So we've had to make really frank conversations around, I mean, do we need to spend this money just to get this level of service, right? And those conversations will continue going on, especially except it's for something that's really critical. But I think the default would be forget air freight, let's go with normal sea freight, right? And we'll take the hit with the service, because we know that demand is still waiting for it anyway. So you're going to recover. And last but not least, on the short term, I think there will still be efforts to stabilize the supply chain going forward. And that will include like building your safety stock, the level that you think is secure enough to meet unanticipated demand. So that would definitely continue. Of course, that is still subject to what people are saying about the wave 2, because I mean there are anticipations that wave 2 is going to hit in the fall, right? So it's almost like we're back to what we were in February when this whole thing started. So that's my opinion on the short term. In the long term, I'll say mid to long term, and I see the background to this is, again, like I said, I'm from the consumer health part of pharma, and which is non-OTC drugs. The eye-opener from COVID-19 is a big dependence or focus on self-care, because with COVID-19, people were not able to go to hospitals anymore, right? You couldn't go see your doctor anymore. It was now, okay, what kind of medication do you have in the house that can address the basic illnesses like allergy, like cough and cold, headaches, body pains, so that you don't need to go to a hospital and increase your risk of contracting COVID-19. So we've seen a lot of people, and it started before COVID-19, where people are going to self-care, and a lot of non-OTC products play in that category, where you could just buy it off the shelf, and whether it's aspirin, whether it's nutritionals, you just buy it off the shelf. So in the long term, possibly I see maybe pharma OTC products switching to non-OTC, because you want to have people being able to readily gain access to this kind of medication without having going through a doctor or a pharmacist. You just buy it off the shelf, or you buy it off of the internet, and it's delivered to your house. So that for sure, I think, is one big move. So you see a lot of switches from pharma to consumer health. And like we said before, I mean, a lot of companies on supply chains, they are reassessing the supply networks, right? I think for the North American business, like I said earlier, this overdependence on Europe and Asia was called to the fore. So what I see happen going forward is more local manufacturing, probably more in the US, and maybe by extension also Latin America. So Mexico, countries like Guatemala may be called to the fore, where companies would rather source from Latin America, which is shorter compared to sourcing from Europe or Asia. So I see the North America, Latin America collaboration going stronger as we kind of evolve into the future. And I think it was everyone that mentioned it about risk management too. Again, people are going back to the drawing board to say, how do we anticipate such kind of risks? It's unparalleled, it's unprecedented. But now people are now thinking that let's throw all our risk registers into the garbage and just come up with potential risks that can significantly disrupt our systems. So we give examples. I won't go back to all of that. So like multiple sourcing and all that. All of that is going to be critically looked at now to say how do we avoid this going forward so we're not caught pants down. I talked about e-commerce. I won't dwell too much on that. Amazon e-commerce is definitely going to stay. A lot of people staying at home for this long have gotten used to ordering things online, right? By necessity as a lifestyle. I don't think they will break that lifestyle. So that is going to continue, and that growth is going to continue for sure. And definitely, maybe not on more of the work-life balance aspect of things. I think this conversation around working from home versus working from the office, I think is going to continue. It's going to be really heated up because on one hand, there's cost and benefits, right? Not just to the employees, but also to the employers, right? So to the employees, for instance, all of a sudden, you don't have to worry about commuting. You don't have to worry about traffic jams, transportation costs, like Charlie said. But then on the downside, you're going to sacrifice face-to-face meetings. You're going to sacrifice one-on-one connections with your employees. You're going to sacrifice taking advantage of the infrastructure and the facilities that you have in a physical office. You're going to sacrifice all of that. So I see that struggle continue for employees and for employers as well. So overhead costs versus having employees work from home and gain productivity. So offices are shut down for almost 5-6 months now, but the costs are not going anywhere. Employers are still paying costs for occupying those buildings. So then there's a trend to say, okay, so do we consider having like a pseudo arrangement where people just come and go and use our facilities, not the entire facility, but just a fixed location or fixed space, just to reduce overheads and operating costs for the employers. And last but not least, I mean, this one, I still haven't wrapped my head around it, but I think what COVID-19 did was just to take the limits off mobility. Before now, people would say, oh, I'm physically in Canada, I can't work in the US. Or I'm physically here in, say, Toronto, I can't work in, say, Vancouver. I think all those norms, all those mindsets are completely out of the window because right now everybody's working from home. And I mean, I, for one, my office is in New Jersey, but I'm right now with my family in Guelph in Ontario, Canada. And I've been working for like that 6 months now, right? And it hasn't stopped my work. It hasn't reduced my productivity, you know? So I think what that portends for potential employability, I think is immense because all of a sudden employers are not saying, oh, this person is not physically here. They're now saying, oh, we can work with you, right? You don't have to be physically here because in the last 6 months, we've seen people can work anywhere and still bring it on. So I think for me, those are the key considerations for the future. And like I said earlier, we're not definitely going back to the norm. Things have changed. Thank you.
I agree. And I think that the ability to work from anywhere is really going to be both a benefit to the companies and to the employees themselves. And we're seeing that mindset shift even in technology. And there's a bit of a surprise, and you're going to see some population rebalancing in different areas of the world. I mean, from urban areas to more suburban or even rural ones. And Everin, what are your thoughts on the short and the long-term outlook of the industry as a result of COVID-19?
Okay, so obviously we talked about the trends extensively in this webinar about digitalization and the need to transform so that we can better manage what lies ahead. So your question about new normal. I think this will keep coming in front of us, as a new normal. Another pandemic will hit, or another big crisis happen, or a global economic crisis maybe, and then we'll keep talking about new normal. I think everything is changing continuously anyway. The only thing that doesn't change is the change itself, right? So I think the concept of being ready for the future, or future-proofing your supply chain or your business, to me, it's all about one keyword, and that is the trade-offs. How do you constantly look at your trade-offs and make better decisions about your business, right? I think this is true for both short-term and long-term. Short-term, it's always going to be a little struggle to just do whatever you can as best as you can, like leverage your existing factory capacity to meet the short-term needs, or leverage your existing setup or your employees, or your capacities to get the most out of your business. But in the long term, which is the real opportunity and the risk here, is ability to build an organization that is digitally savvy, so that you can constantly evaluate the right trade-offs and make the right decisions, right? This crisis showed us like what is essential, what is not essential, right? Like government made those determinations, like if your business is essential, you can open. If you're not essential, you should not open. We lived it in our personal lives. We actually realized that certain purchases that we make are not necessarily essential. We can very, very well cook at home and eat at home, right? Certain things are luxury, or just we do it because we want to do it. But now that we are, seeing these major changes, it makes us question, how we can be better prepared the next time, or continuously be ready for making those right trade-offs. In our perspective as a company, as we talk about, supply chain strategy, being future ready or future-proof, we talked about a 3D transformation, the digital transformation. The 3D stands for the data, dashboard, and decisions, right? If you are looking to get a business result, right, that's your future, or any business result that you're seeking, whether it's growth or profitability or expansion, you need to be making the right decisions, right? That's the third D, which is the most valuable D. In order to make the right decisions, you should be looking at the right dashboard, or the right insight, right trade-offs, the things that your analysis would tell you what is the right decision, right? And in order to build the right dashboard, you need the right data. So the transformation happens forward, from data to dashboard to decision, but the strategy happens backward. Like you put the ultimate goal of your business goal, whatever it is, then you will come to the, which decision I'm making, I should be making more clearly or better, then which dashboard or reports or visibility, then the data, right? In this fashion, I think companies are going to be a lot more careful about which decisions they're making. Are they making more about database, data-driven decisions, or are they calling more for experience of the executives? But the pandemic showed us that our experience is not necessarily very helpful, because nobody experienced such a thing. So in my opinion, whether it's for pharma or other industries, the trade-offs and the ability to evaluate those trade-offs with data would be a huge and probably the most important competitive advantage. And all of this will result in a race towards more digitalization, creating those competitive advantages through analytics, through the technologies like blockchain and the ability to trust the data, right? The traceability in everything, not just the product traceability, but also the people, the processes, everything that you're doing in your supply chain will be more and more traceable at the more and more granular level. And the companies will be making those trade-off decisions better. It's a journey. It was a journey. It's always a journey. But I think the journey has just got accelerated dramatically. So fasten your seatbelts. We are taking off to a new world. And we'll be talking about these topics more frequently, more and more. So thank you for the opportunity, John, to comment on this important area of our field.
Absolutely. And Chaitali, how do you see the short and the long term moving forward for the industry?
To be honest, I think the next 15 to 18 months are really going to determine as to which way the industry is going to go. And there is no doubt about there is no doubt about it that the industry, all industries will sell and operate completely different. Both Evelyn and John have elaborated on the points very wonderfully. But the fact remains that, I mean, adding on to that, working at the warehouses would get more autonomous. I know for a fact that the government will have to do a lot for the infrastructure in the long term. If we have to, I mean, we are a world player, but if we still need to go up and we need to rise, then a lot of infrastructure development has to be taken. And it's going to take time for that. We need to have the budget allocation for modernization of the freight corridors, for the ports, for the airports. And, you know, we may be strong in a lot of other things, but infrastructure is one of our key weaknesses that needs to go. The transactions are going to become more digital for a country and for an industry which is so heavily dependent upon labor as well as paper. You know, digitalization and technology is definitely is the key of the hour, and it's going to be a long-term thing. There's nothing short-term about it. And Kay very rightly said that there is nothing, you know, our past, it's like now we say before COVID and after COVID. So before COVID is just going to be something in our past, and we are never going to go back to that. So whatever systems, practices that we adopt now, methods that we adopt now, the strategies that we take in now, the policies that we make now is what is going to push us forth. And this is going to be our defining moment. For a lot of companies in the logistics, if we are talking, they would have to rethink what kind of a player they want to be. I mean, we did that internally too, to determine as to how do we want to proceed, what do we want to see ourselves in 5 years, and what kind of work that we want to do. So a lot of introspection is going to be required. And to be very honest, it has to be the right kind of introspection and just not a whitewash or something to make you feel nice and not look at the negatives, because we all tend to look at the positives in ourselves and in our companies and all. But if you really want to change and you want to do something better, you have to look at the in-depth negatives that are there and try and change that around. Because if you can manage to if you can manage to even change 5 major negatives and make them into positives, then that becomes your strength, and that's what is going to get you new clients. You know how they say that disasters lead to new opportunities. So this is going to be an opportunity for a lot of new players who have actually no baggage to bring on, to really just do what they want to do in the present times. Maybe before COVID, they would have to stick to the norms of the industry, but now it's like reinvention time, so they could probably do better than even some of the old companies would be. Like I mentioned, that people would have to rethink their entire supply chain operations. And most importantly, the world is now more aware of the generic pharma industry and the tremendous role that it plays in the affordable public health. So that is like, you know, in the long run is going to be very important. And I think somewhere down the line, everybody is going to look at the big pharma players to see how their attitudes are going to affect their behavior, and attitudes are going to affect the behaviors of the government, the courts, and the regulatory health agencies, and more importantly, the public's perception towards them. Is because if you now prove yourself to be a public player, somebody who wants to do things for the public, that's going to go a long way in getting people to think favorably about you. And right now, you know, when you were talking about counterfeit and all, one of the most important things that the Indian government has done is to make sure that they start plugging in the loopholes whereby the medicines are not being black marketed and they are at reasonable pricing. So I think in the long run, which could also be there, is your pricing of your medicines. And also, more importantly, is going to be your general cost inventory. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's definitely going to be there that somebody who can work with with a lean management, with a leaner operation, is going to survive, and one who doesn't want to make that 50% or 75% margin, keep that margin and work. But if they could work with 20% or maybe even 25%, depending on what industry it is in, because I know in the logistics industry, we barely have any margin to work with to make the profits, but the volumes keep helping us turn around and make money for us. But those are some of the things that I think will go a long way for to normalize, and there is definitely no going back. So this is definitely the new normal. Thank you. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to be part of the webinar. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I want to thank everyone for being a part of this. And, you know, we all know that COVID-19 has shaken things up quite a bit, but at the same time, we know that we try to build our supply chains kind of like Hydra, mythical Hydra. You know, you cut one head off and two grow in its place. That's always kind of our end goal, is to make things more resilient like that and resistant to these types of shocks in the long run. If anyone would like to share a little bit about what you're doing and how to contact you, I'd be more than happy to give you the floor right now. But again, I want to thank you for being a part of this. And I think it's really critical that everyone looks to the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry to learn what this industry is doing and how all the others can adapt to it as well. So if you want to go ahead and volunteer, if you're happy to put your contact info out there and what you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I'm our headquarters in Princeton, New Jersey. You know, audience can reach me at evren.oskaya@supplychainwizard.com, or you can just go to supplychainwizard.com and use the form there to set up a meeting with us if you're interested in you know, supply chain strategy, supply chain digitalization, assessing your supply chain readiness on the consulting side, as well as on the technology side, you know, digital factory solutions and digital supply chain solutions that are helping our clients adapt to the new normal. So thanks again for the opportunity, John. I appreciate it.
John, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of the conference, the webinar. And it's been a pleasure just sharing my thoughts and listening to Evren and Chetali. Thank you so much.
So John, thank you very much for having me on. It's always been my endeavor to present the service side of the industry, because we talk about the exporters, the manufacturers, the importers, but very rarely do we get an opportunity to present our viewpoints from the service side. And for that, I am very grateful. I am Chaitali Mehta, and we are a 43-year-old company based out of Bombay. We have offices all across the country. 50% of our products are pharma related, so we handle everything from the bulk drugs to the formulations to the raw materials to the accessories, everything and anything that's related to pharma. Having said that, we also have several other verticals. We specialize in aviation, so ours is the only company in India that handles the movement of aviation, including helicopters, from start to the bottom. And I'm actually the only person in India doing this. And one of the verticals that we specialize in aviation is related to the helicopters part of it. And besides that, of course, we do a lot of general cargo also. And if you need anything related to exports or imports out of India as a service provider, then please do get in touch with me. My email ID is Chaitali, that is Charlie, Harry, Alpha, India, Tango, Alpha, Lion, Yankee, @ E for elephant, K for kangaroo, F for father, P for Peter, L for Lima.com. And thank you very much for this, John, once again.
Absolutely. And thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining us on this webinar. And we hope that you've gotten some valuable information out of it. And glad everyone could be here.